Welcome to the Employment Law and HR Podcast with your host, Alison Colley.
Hello and welcome to this episode 199 of the Employment Law and HR Podcast. I'm your host, Alison Colley. I'm an employment solicitor and HR specialist, and I run the firm Real Employment Law Advice, where together with my colleagues we provide advice and assistance to both employers and employees. Now, I want to start this episode by saying a huge sorry to all of those people who do listen regularly and who were potentially looking out for the content to come in the next fortnight following the last episode on the 7th of October 2022. I'm really sorry if you're one of those very few people who are desperate for my content, but unfortunately life happened and things got in the way. So I moved house shortly after the last episode was recorded in October, and then I was without the internet for about 6 weeks. So I was unable to record the podcast. And those of you who have listened regularly will know that I often record the podcast in the evenings because I spend the day doing the day job, advising employers and employees. I don't usually get the time to record the podcast, nor is it often conducive to try and record in the office. So I had a long period of time in my new home without the internet. I've also bought a house which needs a lot of work, and in the lead up to Christmas, getting ready for family coming to stay and that sort of thing, it just all became too much. I also have 3 young children and run a business, and so it was all very difficult in terms of workload. I also have a number of colleagues who I work with, but two of my solicitors who are full-time are currently on maternity leave at the same time. So it was just a perfect storm in terms of moving house, no internet, lots of things to do at home taking up my evenings, lots of things to do in the office. And so I wasn't able to record, and in all honesty, something had to give in terms of my own sanity. And so that's why I haven't been recording the podcast. But I have really missed it. I've missed recording the podcast every 2 weeks. I've missed talking to you, and I've missed providing the content. So I'm really pleased to say episode 199, back with a bang, and it will be consistent from now on. I will be scheduling the podcast so it comes out every 2 weeks as normal, and I'd really like to get back to hearing from you, the listeners, with your questions or particular cases or information that you would like covered. Also, if you have any suggestions for anyone I should interview or who you think would be useful for the podcast, I'd love to hear from you. And I have said this before, but I'm always keen to hear from people who have been through the employment tribunal process and who are able to talk about their experience. There's nothing better, I think, than hearing from somebody, whether that's a representative, a HR professional, or an employee who's brought their own case, from hearing from them exactly how they felt about it, the kind of steps that they took on a day-to-day basis. I know it's really rare to be able to get someone who is able to talk about it because often things are bound by confidentiality. But if you have been in an employment tribunal case that you are able to talk about, or you have experiences to share, then again, I would really love to hear from you. My email address, just by way of a reminder, is alison@realemploymentlawsadvice.co.uk, and the website is realemploymentlawsadvice.co.uk. So, after that long introduction and my big apology and explanation, I'm really pleased to get back into this week's featured content. So in this week's episode, I want to talk about the forthcoming teachers' strikes. So as you've no doubt heard in the news, the National Education Union have balloted their members who have voted to strike. And this means that there will be a number of days planned over the next 2 months where schools will inevitably have to close, or certain year groups will have to close. Now, I know that locally where I live on the Isle of Wight, a number of head teachers have written out to parents already and indicated that there will be 5 days when the schools will be closed. And looking at the news reports and the information coming from the NEU, it says currently that they're planning to hold strikes on the 1st of February in England and Wales, the 14th in Wales, the 28th in northern, northwest and Humber regions, the 1st of March in East Midlands, Western and Eastern regions, the 2nd of March in London, South East and South West regions, the 15th of March in England and Wales, and the 16th of March in England and Wales. So depending on where you live in the UK, you could find yourself with a number of days where local schools are closed and children aren't able to go to school. This will inevitably impact on employers, and it's really important, in my view, that you start to prepare for this now, that you take away some of the anxieties that some of your staff may be feeling about childcare and what they're going to do about work. Now, you may recall a couple of years back, around this sort of time, I was talking about closures of schools in relation to COVID. And at that time, furlough was available to employers. So employers were able to furlough their staff and pay them so that they could take caring responsibilities when their children were not able to go to school. Now, we're not in that situation again. Fortunately, we're not talking about long-term closures, but we are talking about disruption, a disruption that will inevitably cause stress all round. So as an employer or a HR professional, it's really important that you have a plan in place and you communicate that to your staff. Now, one of the options that you have is, of course, to allow staff to work from home so that they are at home while their children are also there. It's important to acknowledge that if home working isn't a standard arrangement now, or things have returned back to the office, that it may be logistically quite difficult to set up systems and processes to allow people to work from home. And it may be that they're not geared up for working from home, but it's certainly something to plan ahead for and to think about. Are there certain tasks that can be undertaken from home, for example? The second option, of course, is to allow staff to have that time off as paid time at your discretion, taking into consideration the potential stress, financial impact of unpaid leave, etc., and allow those staff to take those days off. Again, that's in your gift, it's at your discretion to do so, and as long as you explain that you're not setting it out as a contractual benefit or setting a precedent, it's just a one-off, then of course you can make that arrangement without any long-term commitment. Now, this may cause some difficulty with those staff who don't have children or who are able to make alternative childcare arrangements. So you do have to keep in mind the perception of fairness amongst staff if you are allowing some staff to have paid time off at your discretion due to the school closures. But it's certainly an option and something to consider. Another option would be, of course, to arrange time in lieu so that the employees agree to make up the time at a different time, for example. So if they can work in the evenings or at weekends, they make up that time lost when they're at home with their children, and therefore you both benefit from it in that you don't lose out on productivity and the employee doesn't lose out on pay. Another option is, of course, to allow them to take holiday and explain that they have to take out of their annual leave entitlement to cover those days. And then a final option is to offer unpaid leave. Now, under the rights of employees for time off for dependents, if an employee is required to take unpaid leave due to an emergency situation, then they can't be treated to their detriment or dismissed as a result of that. So it is a right that employees have and something that you can discuss with them and allow them to do if you're not able to make any other arrangements for those particular days. So the options, just again for you, as far as I can see, are 1, to allow them to work from home, 2, to give them paid leave at your discretion, 3, to make arrangements in terms of working at different times, lieu times, making the time up, or 4, holiday, and finally 5, unpaid leave under the rights for time off for dependents. When you're thinking about the various options and how you're going to communicate this and what you're going to allow employees to do during this time, it's important to consider the impact that that's going to have. Yes, it's really frustrating that you may lose out on productive time from employees due to the teachers' strikes. But inevitably, most of the parents will be feeling stressed and worried about what's going to happen, particularly if they've got the prospect of potentially 5 days unpaid leave over the next 2 months. We've also got to contend with the fact that thrown in the middle of all these strike days is half term. So again, employees who are parents or have childcare responsibilities will be already thinking about what they're going to do for half term and how they're going to cover, perhaps take holiday, that kind of thing. So they will be worrying about this already, and it's really important from a managerial perspective and employee relations that you have in mind a very clear policy on this. Now, of course, you may have employees who are aggrieved. They may be upset that you're not giving them paid time off. And in that situation, what I would recommend you do is to sit down with the individuals and discuss with them their particular circumstances. It may be that in some cases, if, for example, your policy is it's unpaid leave, you may decide that for a particular employee who may be having financial hardship, that you make some alternative arrangement with them. Now, it's okay to make individual arrangements with employees on a one-to-one basis, as long as you are very clear about your reasoning for it, so that if you are questioned as to why one employee was allowed to do one thing and another employee wasn't, that you have a clear justification for that. And of course, if that information becomes general knowledge, you've got to recognise that there may be some feelings of unfairness, or people might fall out as a result of the fact that their colleagues getting a benefit that they feel that they're not. So there is a balance to be made between taking into consideration individual circumstances and making arrangements, and then the impact that that can have on the wider workforce. Hopefully, after these strikes are done, we won't have any more situations where employees need to take time off due to school closures. But if there is any situation in the future, then the same rules, of course, would apply in relation to your options for those employees. And of course, if an employee has to take time off because their own particular school is closed for whatever reason, or their child is unable to attend school and they're not able to obtain childcare cover, then the time off for dependents rules again apply. If you have any questions about this, or you would like to discuss further, then please don't hesitate to contact me. My email is alison@realemploymentlawadvice.co.uk. Now, of course, if you're an employee listening to this podcast and you are concerned about your own rights in relation to taking time off during the strikes, then you can, of course, raise this with your employer on an individual basis. And if you are dissatisfied with the outcome, you can, of course, raise a grievance under the formal grievance procedure. Thank you so much for listening to this week's podcast. It's really great to be back, and I will commit to being back with you every fortnight from here on in. And as I said at the beginning of the podcast, if you have any questions, suggested topics, or guests that you think would be useful to interview, then please don't hesitate to get in touch. I would love to hear from you. Thanks again for listening. Just want to finalise by saying I wouldn't be a lawyer unless I had a legal disclaimer. So I must just say to you that the information in this podcast is for information only. It's general review and a general update. It's always necessary to get specific legal advice about your circumstances. So please don't rely on anything that you've heard in this podcast. But please do feel free to contact me if you'd like further information or specific advice.